Hi, I'm Jonah, and this is a Learn to Play tutorial for Puff the Magic Dragon. I love this song. It brings back childhood memories of being around the campfire and the stars and the magic that could happen with the dragon coming to visit and beautiful green rolling hills. I think that came from a cartoon I used to watch. So I really love this song, and so it was really fun to be able to do this song and to offer this song. And it is kind of an intermediate song. There's some challenging parts for beginners. There'll be some challenging parts in both the rhythm and the notation. It actually uses a half whole, which is kind of a new thing that can be kind of challenging. And then it often has some eighth notes and dotted quarter notes, which get 1.5 beat. So it has kind of it has some off rhythms that will be new for some of you. But I think it's worth trying for everybody and giving it a go. And it took me a number of times to run through it and to learn how to play it. So go for it and just take the time to do it, and maybe do it a little bits each day if you're a beginner, because it'll really push your playing and it'll really add a lot to your just general playing as well. Now I'm going to be playing this on a high tone flute on the key of C, and I really like this song in the higher tones. I think it's really sweet. You could play it, you could really slow it down and play it on some low tone flutes too, which may be really cool. I haven't experimented with that yet, but I think that would be a really cool thing to do and sound really well, sound really sweet as well. Now I'm going to play through the song once, and then I'll go through a little introduction of how to use this tutorial, and then we'll move right into the tutorial itself. Now, the easiest way that I find to learn songs is to work through them phrase by phrase. Now, phrases are like sentences. You put a bunch of sentences together to build a story. In the same way, you put a bunch of phrases together to build a song. Essentially, each time you pause to take a breath, you've completed a phrase. And because in the music we've added these breath marks, you can easily see that the phrases begin and end at each of these breath marks. I've also noted the number of the phrases using these numbers with lines through them. Phrase 1, 2, and so on. As I walk through each phrase, I'll note anything that's unusual or particularly challenging in that phrase, and then I'll show you how to play it, and I'll play it at a really slow tempo. And at that point, I suggest pausing the video and working on that phrase until you have the fingerings and the rhythm pretty well down at that slow tempo, and then move on to the next phrase. Once you move through the whole song, I suggest going back to the beginning of the song and working through each phrase again. And each time you do that, your hands will memorize the fingerings a little bit more, and you'll memorize the rhythms a little bit more, and the song will get easier to play, and you can start bringing it up to tempo. These are the notes that some of you may not have played before, so when you come to these notes in the song, have some patience with yourself. It may take a little time to learn the transitions from the note before it to this note and to the note after it. I'll also talk more about these transitions and notes as we come upon them in each phrase. This is the sheet music for Puff the Magic Dragon, and the first thing I want to go over is how this is set up. In order to make sheet music more concise, composers will use repeat symbols and other wording that corresponds to each other throughout the music to repeat areas of the music that are the same. For example, in the very beginning here, this section is played twice. And so instead of writing it twice, this symbol right here, this repeat symbol, is added in to tell you to go back to the beginning and play through this section again. And each time, there's a different ending. You have the first time you play through, you play this ending, and then the second time you play through, you play the second ending. And I'll talk in more detail about how to move around in the music as we move through the tutorial itself. Now the other thing I want to point out are the phrase numbers. And as you see here, there's multiple numbers where normally you only see one. And that's because most of the music we work with doesn't have all these repeats within it. And so the way this is working is in phrase 1, when you play this through the first time, it's phrase 1. But then when you come down to the repeat and you go back to the beginning of the song again, it now has become phrase 4. And then as you work through the whole song, eventually you come back here again, and at that point we're at phrase 13. So that's why you're seeing multiple numbers where normally you only see one. This is the first phrase for Puff the Magic Dragon, and in this phrase there's a couple things going on that we want to point out. One, we have this note here, which might be new for some of you, and it's a cross fingering because we're coming off of this note here and moving to that one. So we're opening holes and closing holes at the same time. And then when we're coming off of this note into this final note in the phrase, it's not a cross fingering, just closing down. So it's a little easier transition. But if you haven't done these cross fingerings before, you might need to take a little time to practice crossing back and forth between these notes. This is a very common cross fingering in the song, so you want to take a little time now to get used to the dexterity of it, so that as you move through the song it becomes easier and easier each time you come upon it. Now the other thing I want to point out is the rhythm in this first phrase, and really specifically this dotted quarter note and then this eighth note. Now a dot adds to the note half the value of the note that it's put on. So because a quarter note gets one beat, the dot represents half of that, which is a half a beat. If this was a dotted half note like we see over here, then because a half note gets 2 beats, then the dot equals half of that, or 1 beat. And so a dotted half note gets 3 beats. So the dot adds half the value of the note to it. So going back to this dotted quarter note at the beginning of the song, so we have this dotted quarter note followed by this eighth note. And the transition from this note to this note happens on the offbeat. And so the easiest way to learn what that sounds like and how to play that is to count out the beats. And to explain how to do that in a way that makes sense, I'm going to go over a couple things real quick here. And the first thing is, what is a measure? And sheet music is broken up into measures. From this line to this line is a measure. This line to this line is a measure. And you see this throughout the whole sheet of music. It's all broken up into measures. Now within each measure there are 4 beats, and we know that because of the time signature here. Because it has a 4 on the top, that tells us that there's 4 beats per measure. So that's the basics. So when we count, when we're walking through music and we're counting out the beats to know what it's supposed to sound like, to get a feeling of the rhythm and understand the rhythm, the most basic level is we're counting in 4s. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this second measure here, because it has 2 half notes, each one getting 2 beats, and there's no off beats or anything, so you would just count it. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's how we're counting the measures on a song that's not using any offbeats. When you start adding in the offbeat, we add an and in. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And that and is our offbeat. So to count this dotted quarter note, you would count it as 1 and 2 and that would be, you'd hold it for that whole time. So if my clapping is my note changing, I'll count the notes, I'll count out the measure, and I'll clap when you would change notes. So you would go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So again, it would be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So that's a really good way to start learning what these rhythms that you're seeing on a page, what they sound like, and also what they feel like, because that's what you really want to instill in yourself, is the feeling of the rhythms, so that as you're tapping your foot is giving you a foundation of what the beat of the music is, and then you understand within that what it feels like to transition notes at these different times on the on beat or on the off beat, and how long you're holding it. And you hold this note for 1.5 beats and a quarter or and a half a beat, and then a whole beat and a whole beat. And so you're visually seeing it, and you're starting to know what that feels like. And that takes time of playing music that's on the offbeat and playing sheet music and doing things like clapping it out. And over time, you'll really be able to look at a sheet of music and know what those rhythms feel like and what they sound like. This is the second phrase, and it's pretty straightforward. The rhythm is half notes and quarter notes, and then the dotted half note, like I talked about earlier, gets 3 beats. And the melody is pretty straightforward as well. This is the third phrase, and in this phrase, there's a couple notes that some of you may not have played before. And the one we talked about earlier is this note here, and the transitions going from this note to this note is going to be a cross fingering. So you'll want to practice with that a little bit, and just start off going back and forth really slow without playing the note, even just watching your fingers and kind of moving them back and forth. And then start playing the notes back and forth, and your fingers will get the dexterity pretty quickly. Now the other note that's new is this half hole here. Now this is not very common on the native flute, and so it might take a little bit to get used to how to cover a half hole. And it's done in the rhythm of the music, it's done really quickly because it's done for an eighth note. It's only done for a half a beat. So it's a quick note. And so you want to teach your finger how to catch that half hole. Now some people will cover the whole halfway to one side. I prefer to cover the whole halfway to the bottom, where my finger falls on the bottom half of the hole. And here's a visual of what that looks like. So I've just found that to be the way that I comfortably half hole my notes. If you find covering it halfway to the side is easier, or some other way that I don't even know of that's easier, however you can do it that feels comfortable and easy for you to do, that's the way to do it. Now what I'd suggest is working on these transitions without sounding the flute, meaning just doing the fingering. Working on the transition from this note to the half hole, and then from the half hole to this note. Now you do that for a little bit to just get the dexterity of it, but in order to really hear if you're hitting that half hole or not, you need to sound the flute or blow into the flute. So then start working on it while blowing into the flute. And note that it's a challenging thing to hit a half hole and to have it sound correct, to have it sound in between the note below it and the note above it. And because of the way the holes are situated on the flute, this is the only way to catch this note, is to half hole. So note that it's really challenging to get that half hole correct each time. And in this particular instance, you're moving through it quite quickly. So even if you don't get it exactly on, it'll sound, the melody will sound correct as you move through this section. In general, half holes are pretty challenging to catch exactly on. And so if as you're starting to work through this and learning this half hole, if you get it a quarter of the time, that's great. You're striving for all the time, but don't get stuck here trying to work through it till you get it every single time. I would say my track record is probably 3/4 of the time, because it's not something that I use all that often in my playing. People that use it all the time, you can get to where you can hit it really easily. It just takes time and practice to make that happen. Now the rhythm in this phrase is pretty straightforward, except in this measure right here. And this is a rhythm that's repeated a number of times in the song, and so it's a really important rhythm to work with. So again, I'd suggest counting it out. So I'm going to count it out, and the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to count one measure first without clapping, and then I'll clap this measure, and my clapping is where the note would change, where you would change notes to the next note. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So I'll do it again. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So you're changing notes on the offbeat from here to here, and then when you're going from this note to this note, again, you're changing it on the 2 and, on the and after the 2. So again, it's on the offbeat. So take a little time with this measure, and first count it out and clap your hands to the rhythm to this rhythm in this measure. And then once you start getting to where you can clap it pretty consistently, then add the flute in and go at a really slow tempo. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and or even slower if you need to in the beginning. And play on one note. Just play the rhythm on one note. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So do that at a really slow tempo, and as you get more comfortable with it at that really slow tempo, then start adding in the note changes to make the melody. So at first you're just working with the rhythm at a really slow tempo, and then start working with the melody at that slow tempo. And then as you become comfortable with the two of them, you can start speeding it up. Now what I highly encourage is tapping your foot, because tapping your foot gives you the physical feeling of what the rhythm is. And music has this really physical component to it. And you often hear me and other people talking about the feeling of music. And that's what we're talking about, is the feeling that comes along with it, a physical feeling of music. And having your foot tap is giving you that physical feeling of what that rhythm sounds or feels like. And then as you're adding in the onbeat and the offbeat, you can feel what the onbeat is. It's when your foot hits. And what the offbeat is. It's when your foot's in between hitting. And as you start getting comfortable with that and learning these rhythms, they'll start integrating into a feeling of what the rhythm feels like. What you're seeing on the page will start becoming will translate into a physical feeling. And that's done by doing all these steps that I'm talking about. At least that's how I've learned how to do them. So I've found that to be a really helpful way to move in that direction of being able to learn these rhythms, and as I'm playing through music, feeling the music moving through me. And like I mentioned earlier, this particular rhythm and melody of this measure comes up a number of times through the song. It's a real key component to the song, Puff the Magic Dragon. So I encourage you to take some time to get comfortable with it right now, and then as we keep moving forward in the song, it'll become easier and easier. So now we're at phrase 4 here. And the way that we got back to the beginning of the song essentially is because when we played through phrase 3 the first time, we got to this number 1 into the box here, and that's the first ending for phrase 3. When we played all the way through to the end, we hit this symbol right here. And this is a repeat symbol. It says, go back to the beginning of the song and play through again. So that took us back to the beginning of the song, which the first phrase, it was the first phrase, but now is phrase 4. So all the components are the same here. So I'm not going to talk through it again because it would be kind of redundant. So play through it again and work on this phrase, and then we'll move on. Here we are at phrase 5, which, like all these phrases we're moving through here, are repeats. So this was phrase 2, now it's phrase 5. It's a pretty straightforward phrase, so I'm going to let you work through it, and then we'll move on to phrase 6. Here we are at phrase 6. So phrase 6 has some components that are a repeat that are exactly the same as phrase 3. It's essentially this beginning part of it. But once we move through to here, when we hit this was the first ending, this section here. Instead of playing the first ending, we're going to play the second ending down here. And if you notice the second ending, the box is not complete on the end. It's open on the right side here. And that says, as you play through the second ending, you just keep moving on in the music. So the first time we played through, and we played through the first ending, we hit the repeat symbol, went back to the beginning of the song, played through. The second time through, at this point, we jumped down to the second ending, we played through, and then we just keep going in the song. So all the rhythm, all the notation is pretty much the same. The difference is here in the second ending, the melody is just a little bit different. Now in the second ending, there's some cross fingering. So going from this note to this note is a cross fingering, and then going from this note to this note is a cross fingering. And I would suggest working on each cross fingering separately if cross fingering has been a little bit challenging. So without playing in the flute, go between this note and just go back and forth between them slowly at first, and then just start speeding it up, and then add your breath in and play back and forth between the two notes, and then do the same thing for going from this note to this note. And I think you'll find pretty quickly that the dexterity will come along in this exercise. Now when you're playing through the whole phrase and you hit that, it might take a little bit more time for your fingers to remember that dexterity after having done all this other notation, all these other changes. So that's the next component. Play through it really slowly again, catching each section, working maybe even measure by measure, because this is a more challenging phrase, working measure by measure, and then speeding it up, working through the whole phrase, and then speeding it up a little faster and faster and faster until you bring it up to tempo. Here we are at phrase 7. And phrase 7, the rhythm is straightforward and the melody is pretty straightforward. The only thing that I point out is the cross fingering going from this note to this note. And that's a cross fingering that you've seen multiple times already and been working with. So I don't think you'll have much challenge with this phrase here. Here we are at phrase 8, and phrase 8 has a change of notes right here on the offbeat, this 8th note to this 8th note tied to this quarter note. So the 8th note tied to the quarter note is 1.5 beats, because an 8th note is a half a beat and a quarter note is a whole beat. So it's the same thing as a dotted quarter note, so it gets 1.5 beats here. Now, the easiest way to kind of get the feel of what this feels like is to count it out. So it goes like this. So now I'll count 2 previous beats and then we'll move into this measure, and I'll count out this phrase and clap the notes when you would make the transitions. So 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2, 3. Okay, now faster. Now up to tempo. 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2, 3. 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2, 3. 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2, 3. Here we are at phrase 9, and if you look through this section, there's 2 different endings. There's this ending number 1 and this ending number 2. And so as we play through phrase 9, we'll play through, this is our first time through, so we'll play through the first ending. And I'll talk more about where you go and what you do when you hit this repeat symbol that we see here in phrase 10, because it has more to do with phrase 10 than it does with phrase 9. Now in phrase 9, we have this measure here with a rhythm and a melody that's really similar to phrases 3 and 6. And so you've kind of worked through these transitions before, but I'd suggest again here, give yourself some more time to work through them again. And the transitions of the fingerings, work through them for the dexterity of it, and then work through for the rhythm of it as well. Now, one of the differences in this phrase, in this measure versus in measures in phrase 3 and 6, the same measure that we see in phrase 3 and 6, is that this note here, in this version of it, in this variation of it, is a quarter note, where in the other phrases it's 2 eighth notes. And so what I've found for me is when I've worked through something and kind of memorized it because it's a challenging section, I tend to want to repeat that same section, and it can be kind of take a little bit of time to get myself to shift little pieces of it here and there. So pay attention to make sure that you do hit this as a quarter note and not 2 eighth notes. And then we have some cross fingering here in the first ending as well, going from this note to this note. So now we're at phrase 10 here, which was phrase 7. So we ended up back here because of what happens at the end of phrase 9. So I'm going to skip to phrase 9 and show you what's going on here. So at the end of phrase 9, as we move through, we got to this repeat symbol here. Now, as we look, so that tells us we're going back into the song somewhere that we've already been. So if we look through, when we go back through the song and we see at the beginning of phrase 7 and 10, so the beginning of this measure right here, we see the repeat symbol but facing the other direction. And when we see this, we go back to there. So if this was not here, that repeat symbol at the end of phrase 9 would tell us to go back to the very beginning of the song. But because this symbol is here, that repeat symbol at the end of phrase 9 tells us to go back to here and then to play through. So that's how we ended up back at this point, which was phrase 7 when we played through it the first time. Now is phrase 10 as we play through this the second time. So here we are at phrase 10, which was the same as phrase 7. So we have the cross fingering going from this note to this note. But other than that, it's a very straightforward phrase. Because we're repeating these sections again, phrase 11 is the same as phrase 8. So I've talked through the rhythm here, so you've worked through this once before. So work through it again, and each time you'll memorize it a little more and be able to move through it more smoothly. Phrase 12. So phrase 12, same as phrase 9. So we've talked about this, the rhythm here. So, the difference between phrase 9 and phrase 12 is in phrase 9 we played the first ending. Now in phrase 12 we're going on to the second ending. So move through this in the same way that you did in phrase 9, working on any of the challenges you have here with the rhythm or the fingering in the half hole. And then when you get to the end of this measure, we're skipping down here to play the second ending. Now in the sheet music that you print, this is actually 2 pages. In this version, I've pulled them both together so that you can visually see them more easily. But the endings for the first ending and the second ending here are actually another sheet of paper when you print it in the PDF. So it's really helpful when you're playing this song to have printed both sheets and have them side by side so that you can jump around between these more easily, because they're not as fluid as they look here. Now the second ending has some cross fingerings in it, going from this note to this note, then going from this note to this note, and then again going from this note to this note. So these are cross fingerings that you've seen before, so it's likely that your fingers are getting the dexterity of it and they're becoming easier at this point. But if you're having any issues, go ahead and work through them in the way that I've described earlier in the tutorial. Now at the end of phrase 12, at the end of the second ending here, you can see it says right here, to chorus. And what that's telling us is to go back in the song to the chorus. And if you look back all the way at the beginning of the song here, it says chorus. So we've come back to the chorus from phrase 12, and so now we're at phrase 13, which was also phrases 1 and 4. So go ahead and work through this phrase. If you need an explanation again of like the dotted quarter note and the eighth note and the rhythms and some help with this one again, I'd suggest going back to where I talked about it in phrase 1, because I don't want to go over it all again here in order to keep the video more concise. Phrase 14 is also phrases 2 and 5. So again, I'll let you work through this and then we'll move on to phrase 15. Now here we are at phrase 15, and as you move through the phrase you see this last time to ending, and here I have the PDF version where it's 2 different pages put up here, and you can see over here on the second page it says ending under this square that's open-ended on the right side. And so where it says last time to ending, then we skip all the way to the ending, and this is the end of the song. Now, the view that I just jumped to here on your screen is a conglomeration of pages 1 and 2, and I did this in order to make it easier on your eyes to see the jump from the last time to the ending, so your eyes don't have to jump from one place to the other. When you have the sheet music in front of you, you're going to have to make that jump, but for the tutorial it makes it a little easier to see how this phrase pulls together when you put it together this way. Now I have all this as one phrase, and going at tempo of the song, it's doable to move through this all as one phrase. If you need to split it up into 2 phrases, you feel free to, and that's true for anywhere in the song. If you are going to split phrases up, try to do it in places that feel like there's a natural pause in the song in order to catch a breath. Now I've talked about the melody and the rhythm in this section of the song to some extent in phrase 3 and phrase 6, so in order to keep the video somewhat concise, I'm not going to go over it again. But I'd suggest going back and listening if you're needing help with any of this or needing some direction again with this section. Now there's some cross-fingering here at the very end of the song, going from this note to this note, and then this note to this note. But it's pretty straightforward. Again, you've seen these cross fingerings a number of times. So I think at this point it's likely that you'll be able to catch these pretty easily without taking too much time to learn the dexterity of it. It's mostly putting that dexterity into place with all the other notation as you're moving along and having your fingers remember that particular combination after having done a lot of combinations before that. a lot of air going that slow.